thing, you can see the categories that we're going to kind of talk about tonight. We're not going to do fermentation because fermentation is another class that's coming up. But we're going to talk about all of these different ways to do things. Oh, and we already did a canning class too. So hopefully I won't. There we go. There's too many problems here. There we go. So how are we going to keep it? All of these ways that I just showed you. We can keep our food in the garden and the fridge and the cellar and many other ways. So the first one that we can talk about is that you can keep it in the garden. And if you want to know the details about keeping things in the garden, we have a previous recording for you. So in your resource page, it says keeping food in the garden. It's the June class, and you can go to the YouTube link for that and watch that class about how to plant, what to plant, when to plant it, how to protect it, and make sure that you are able to have lots of food. Now is not really the time to plant for fresh food in the garden, but if you do, and I know a lot of us do have fresh food that is in the garden, we might have beets or carrots and we don't know what to do with them in order to preserve them. So a lot of the things on this list don't need any, in this picture, don't need any protection. Some of them need protection just from the cold. Some of them need protection from the rain. And so here is who gets what on protection. So basically no protection you can do for brassicas that aren't bearing heads. So like kale holds up really, really well in our climate. If you're new here, some people don't know that it holds up well. You can cover it if you want to, but most people don't. Then we have things that require a little protection. They need cardboard thrown over them, a couple of layers of cardboard or straw, or my favorite is chopped leaves because they're just everywhere and they're really good for the soil. And those are root crops. So including root crops and leeks can be done that way. Carrots and beets and parsnips and all those things. I only do it during freezes because voles like to get into that cover of the leaves and eat my beets. So what I actually do is I look at the weather every 10 days or so and I say, is there any freeze coming through January? And if I note it, I don't force myself to remember like every day that I have to put leaves on the plants on Thursday afternoon. I just put it on my electronic calendar and it says, throw leaves, freeze coming. And I throw leaves on there. And before I throw the leaves on, actually, I'll pull some of those beets and put them in the fridge because I want to make sure I get some that the voles aren't going to get in case any vole damage happens. And then I throw the leaves on. And then after the freeze, I might pull those leaves back, put them somewhere else or something because the voles just love that. And vole populations go up and down, up and down. So I've only had a really bad vole problem once when I had really thick mulch. But if you have tall grass around your garden, or you see tunnels, or you can note tunnels in loose mulch, voles are not really much for burrowing in the ground, although they will, but they really like to make tunnels through grass and through sometimes through sort of those grasses that are kind of ground cover hedge grasses. Yeah, so you can take it off if you have a problem with voles. You can also use tunnels. That's for things that freeze, but also for things that are rain sensitive, like escarole and lettuce. If you have winter lettuce, bok choy and green onions will get slimy in the rain, and spinach and chard might survive better because they will have a little bit of frost protection. And oh yeah, brassicas like cauliflower or broccoli, even if it's a sprouting broccoli that makes little sprouts, the heads themselves can freeze, even if the plant is tough enough to tolerate it. So if you have heads that are actually ready and you have 7 of them and you don't want all of them in your fridge and it's January, then I just take a towel, kind of a rag towel, and fold it up really thickly and put it on top. and the snow comes and it seems to protect it sufficiently. That's in my experience. You can also you can use a towel and a tunnel if you want to. And how to make those tunnels is in our March class. It's also referred to in the June class, but the March class has a dauntingly detailed description of where you get the material and stuff like that. And the tunnels that I use are lightweight. They are easily mobile. They're super easy to make, and they involve no PVC. So you can certainly use PVC tunnels that are anchored down in your garden, but if you're curious, I would definitely take a look at the March class because it's an alternative that is very popular. So let's see. Oh yeah, and this picture we've seen a lot. This picture is, every lump in this picture is food with snow on top of it, and it's perfectly fine. So that's how we can hold them in the garden. We can also hold things in the fridge. You can hold some root crops and things in the fridge for a long time. So if you think, I don't want to keep my carrots in the fridge, I don't want to keep my parsnips, I don't want to keep them in the garden, or you can't for some reason, you can keep them in the fridge. You're going to need fridge space for that, but we can keep them in the fridge. We need to remember when we're doing produce, even fresh produce is sometimes challenging in a fridge. Produce is a living thing and it stays alive after it's off the plant, which doesn't happen. If an octopus loses an arm, that arm doesn't stay alive for weeks, but produce does. So it's taking in oxygen and giving off CO2. People always think that plants take in CO2 and give off oxygen, but they actually do what we do. They breathe in oxygen and give off CO2, and that can have an effect on them. They're metabolizing stuff inside their bodies. They're giving off ethylene gas, sorry, which is a ripening gas. So as the thing ripens, some of them give off ethylene, especially fruit. And that actually makes it ripen faster. It's a feedback loop, and it will make its neighbors ripen faster. That's why you're not supposed to put apples and onions in the same drawer, because it can make the onions sprout and or rot when you get the ethylene off the apple. And also they are giving off moisture and they give off field heat. So they're not making heat like me make body heat, but you need to chill them when you get them in from the field. So we think that we can I did anyway, think that I could just shove the thing in the freezer in the crisper maybe. And it says on the crisper, it says humidity controlled. Or in the 70s, it used to say something lyrical like fresh and fancy. And it was supposed to be this humid environment. But most crisper drawers are no more humid, not much more humid than the rest of the fridge. And I have produce all over the fridge anyway. So we tend to think that the fridge is a damp environment because it feels like cold and moist, right? But it's not particularly damp. In fact, your fridge is a big, cold, slow robot dehydrator, because cold air can't hold much moisture, and the process of chilling that air pulls water out of the air. So a lot of vegetables their ideal storing conditions require 90 to 95% humidity. That's really high. And cold temperatures. And a fridge has about between 30 and 50% humidity, no matter what that front of the produce drawer says. So I would recommend that we want to keep the veg from drying out, and we want to slow its metabolism down. So we're going to get it out of the sun. If you're at your pea patch and you're going to be there for 3 hours, I wouldn't make picking my first thing I was going to do and then leave it out in the sun. And chilling it is super important. So farmers try to chill as quickly as possible, but they don't package it, if they're going to package it, until they've chilled it, because all that time that it's warm in the fridge, moist air is coming out of it, moisture is coming out of it, entering the air. And if it's in a bag or something, it's going to condense on the inside of the bag, and that fosters rot. So that's why we bag it after it's cold, which it sounds maybe like that's an extra step, but it's not that hard. I just come in, dump it on the freezer shelf, and then after dinner, I look in there and I think, oh yeah, I have to put that in a bag. And we might want to, especially for longer term storage, leave an air gap, because it's taking in and giving off gases. That's usually for longer term stuff. If I have a head of lettuce in a bag and I'm going in there every other day to get some more lettuce out for a salad, that's enough air exchange. It doesn't have to breathe. It's not like a puppy. It's not taking in that much because their metabolism are really slow. And if you want to save something like pickling cucumbers for a while until you have a big enough batch, you can put them on a paper towel and then roll them up in paper towel so that they have paper towel around each one. And that sounds wasteful of paper towels, but and you're going to put them in a bag, by the way. But then I recommend that you reuse those paper towels because they're darn clean, and then compost them. And we don't put greens into the fridge. We don't put them in and let them chill because the fridge will dry them out so quickly. So we chill them in cold water, which also, as home gardeners, we know that there's a lot of, like, there can be slug waste on the greens, and soaking them is a great way to get that slug waste to come off easily. Does anybody have some question about this, or do you disagree completely? Does your crisper drawer just work perfectly and you can put celery in there and it never dries out? In my defense for saying this stuff, like, of course people know to put bags on their produce. I know a ton of people who only at, like, just recently in their 60s realized that a plastic bag retains moisture for the produce and that it lasts longer. So yeah. And the same thing is for longer term refrigeration. So these are the things that I would say I would leave in my garden. So of this list, I would probably leave everything in my garden except celery root, but I can understand wanting to bring it in. And the only difference, I think, is that you probably want to perforate the bags more because it is a longer term storage. Maybe you will have to adjust. Like, I would do a little perforation and then see if you get a lot of moisture buildup and do a little more perforation and maybe open the bag a little bit and see how you have to adjust for your situation. And we leave a 1/4 inch of stem on the top. So don't take the stem all the way off. Don't cut into the carrot, for example. That's because you cut into its vascular tissue then, and it's going to just give up the moisture. And don't leave it too long or it'll rot. So yeah. Oh yeah. And the last thing says checking and culling. That is not a sign. The fact that you might have a carrot rot or potatoes go bad or something is not a sign that you're not doing it as well as you possibly can. Checking and culling produce throughout the winter time has been the role of maids and children as long as we have been storing food. So young women and children were told to go check the produce and cull out all the ones we have to use right away. And so probably as long as we've had stored food, we've been doing that. It's just part of what we have to do. An alternative to this, say you have to pull your carrots out of your garden and you absolutely don't have the fridge room for them. You can do something that root cellarers do. My mom's family lived without electricity and all that, and they did root cellaring. So this is a box of damp sawdust. You note that there's sawdust under the carrots. The box is a breathable material. The sawdust is not as damp as it should be here. I don't think it doesn't look very damp. It should be moist. You shouldn't be able to squeeze water out of it, but it can be, it should be damp because what you're trying to do is make a humid environment for the carrots. And then you're going to put the carrots in so they aren't touching. And they're also not touching the walls because you want sawdust all the way around every carrot. And these carrots, I'd probably put them a little closer, but it's the best picture. And then you're going to cover them with a layer of the damp sawdust and another layer of carrots, etc. And then you can put it in the coldest spot you've got. And usually I don't have a cold enough spot to store them very well at all until probably November, December, January. Yeah. So I've done this before, but I prefer to leave them in the ground if I can and use the fridge if I can't, but people do this. So the coldest spot you have would probably be, that doesn't freeze, would be in a shed, would be great. You need to keep it up off the ground so that rodents can't get to it. Does anybody have a question or some folk wisdom, or you grew up doing this or anything?
Anna had a question about green beans. It's in chat.
Oh, sorry. Not seeing the chat. There we go. Oh, greens after soaking them. Oh, you want to get them as dry as possible. So we soak them, rinse off everything, all the grit or whatever's on them, and then spin them dry. And you don't have to have a salad spinner for that because people have been spinning um, greens dry for probably the history of greens. I don't know. I mean, that's an overstatement, but there are lots of traditional ways to spin them without having to have a big plastic spinner in your pantry or your cupboard. And you all remember, I think, when salad spinners were invented, because that was a new problem that we had. But probably your parents, my mom, used to use a giant tea towel. I have used a clean, super clean old pillowcase, and you put the greens in, line them up if you can so that the bottom of the greens are at the bottom of the bag or the towel. And then you go outside and you spin the heck out of it. And yeah, that's a traditional way to do it. And then you're going to put them in a bag. You can put a towel around them. If they're still quite wet, you can put a towel and that towel will take up some of the extra moisture. If they're dry and you put a dry towel in, that towel can dry it out. Anna, did that answer your question or not? Oh, great. Okie doke. All right. Okay, so we have things in the garden that we're keeping. We're storing things in the fridge. And then there are some things that don't like to be in the fridge, but we still have resources to store those too. So these ones can go in the cellar. So if you're thinking, oh no, I have to pry my floorboards up and create something, you're either excited by that or feeling dread, but I don't do that. And most people don't do it that way, especially around here, because root cellars were designed for people who, if they put things in a garage or a shed, would have those things freeze solid in 10 below weather. So that's why they dug into the ground. So we don't really have to have it a cellar. If you want to make one, I suppose you could try it. But these plants right here, these crops, they don't love being in the fridge. So we can cellar and we can do just the best we can when we're cellaring. Let's see. Yeah. These like cool and typically dry conditions. These alliums like cool and dry conditions. Anything related to an onion on here. The squash likes it pretty cool and dry. The potatoes like it cool and pretty moist actually, but they tolerate our humidity because potatoes like the farmers store them at like 40 degrees, maybe, but somewhere between 38 and 50 degrees and 90 to 95% humidity. Well, we can't do that here necessarily. But what we can do is 80% humidity because our humidity in November through January is about 80%. So that's pretty good. And when we cellar these things, we are not necessarily going to get to the perfect conditions, but we can store them in places where they will store quite well. Anna wants to know, should you refrigerate onions after cutting them? Definitely. Any produce that you've cut open, any of these should be refrigerated after you open them. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to get as close as we can. A crop that will last 8 months if it's supposed to be stored at 33, because that's ideal, will last 4 months at temps up to 50. And that quote is actually from a USDA storage document. So we're just encouraging you that you don't have to necessarily store it for 8 months, but get it as cool as you can if it likes cool temps. And definitely eat what you store, because some people have this idea that they need to save it, save it, save it. And then their produce rots in about May, or it sprouts in April or something. So I'd rather finish it a little early than to have to toss it out. I really appreciate the questions, by the way. Thank you. Okay, well, let's look at potatoes. So you can look for long storing varieties. So look at this. I love this chart. This is so many potatoes, potato varieties. See, what I'm showing is only goes down to D, and it just goes on forever. And this is, you can get an organic variety from this particular vendor. This is Fedco seeds, but you can buy them elsewhere, or you can get conventional. You can look for different maturities. Like, do you want it to be a long season? I like a long season potato because I want that potato. I don't want that potato to be ready in July because I'm kind of tired of potatoes by the time summer rolls around. And potatoes for me are a winter food, so I want it to be maturing late. So I have potatoes that I planted probably end of April out there, started them fairly late, and they're lush and green right now, some of my potatoes. And they're not going to dry down for another probably month, which is just fine with me. But we can also look at is storage. Look at this, and it's sortable. So now this is mixed in this category, but I'm going to sort it. And suddenly I can see all the kinds that are excellent at storing. And it really does depend, how well they store is variable by type. So that is one thing that you can do, is get those good ones and dig them up late. I leave them in the soil. I have some other potatoes that have died back, but they're still in the soil. And you actually technically can leave them in the soil over winter here, but there are a few reasons that we don't. One, if you're digging them when the soil is wet, you will make bricks, and it's terrible for the soil structure. Two, late blight and possibly other blights overwinter only in living tissue. And potatoes are a prime source of late blight overwintering. They're a prime host. So even if you have a few that come up in the spring and you think, oh, I'll just leave it there, you might consider yanking those out because they have overwintered. And if there were late blight that year, then they would harbor it. So I dig them late. And if I know the soil is about to get soaked and I just don't have time in my schedule, I will take like some trash bag or something and throw it over the bed and put rocks on it so that I can dig them up later. Because they're also easier to clean if the soil is, it can be damp but not soaking wet. Eat those damaged ones first, and then you're going to cure them in the dark, like the garage at that point, 45 to 60 degrees for a couple of weeks. Because we want the surface to become tough. New potato skin, you can wash it off just by brushing it. You can get the skin off a lot of times just by scrubbing it underwater. So we don't want to do that. We want to handle them like delicate little things and maybe just get the soil off with our hands. You don't have to wash them. If you do wash them before storage, you want to get them bone dry. So just let them air dry and eat the damaged ones first. And we're going to store them in the dark, so 38 to 55 and 90 to 95% humidity. So our outdoor humidity is 80%. I store mine in the garage. I put them in the coolest part of the garage, which is not against the wall that's attached to the house, but on the other side if you can. It may not make any difference in your garage, so but sometimes it does for people. So you can get a thermometer and check and just keep track of it if you want to. You can also bag potatoes in a well-perforated bag, and then you would have to put them in a fridge in order to do that. You can put them in a fridge, but that would have to be like a dedicated fridge because your fridge should be lower than 38. Ideally, it's like closer to 33. And you would need a little fridge that you set to like 40, 45 or something like that. Whoops, up we go. You can store them in a cardboard box. You can put cardboard between the layers of potatoes, but yeah, sometimes I do that. I have a big shelf and I just put cardboard on the shelf and I just lay them on the shelf. As long as it's dark, I think you're okay. Let's see, don't store them with fruit. We know that. And when they sprout, as long as the sprouts are white, because you've kept them in dark, 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 you can knock those sprouts off. if the sprouts are green or the potato is green, have I ever cut the green part off and eaten the potato? Yes, I have. But if you repeatedly do that, you're exposed to solanine, which is in the potato. I can't remember why that's bad for us if it's neurotoxin. And it's in the whole potato. It's not just in the green part. So it's not a great thing to do with a lot of potatoes. What else? Oh, I would say when I put them in a box on a shelf in my garage, I will throw over, I have these like a black tarp or something I'll put over it to keep it possibly a little bit higher humidity, but also dark, super dark. Oh, let's see. Should you refrigerate? Oh, are more colorful potatoes better for you? Darker colored potatoes have more anthocyanins in them. And there is a book, if you're interested in that. Thank you, Anna. If you're interested in that, there's a book called Eating on the Wild Side. And she says anything darker, even if you're buying it at the grocery store, if you can get a darker apple, you can get a more colorful, darker vegetable. It has more antioxidants and anthocyanins in them. So I'm not a nutritionist though, but that is my understanding. So it's called Eating on the Wild Side. Winter squash like to be cellared too. So it always says harvest when the rind cannot be cut with your thumbnail. I say easily cut because I have strong thumbs and strong thumbnails and I could probably puncture a lot of things. So it's relatively hard. You can dent it. If you pushed really hard, you could get through it, but it's just not like a zucchini rind. Like a zucchini rind is really fragile, right? So leave them on the vine as long as you can. Ideally, we would bring them in before the temperatures go below 55 because 55 can be damaging. So that's what people say who live in warmer places than this. But we often have 55 degrees now, right? Overnight. So 50 to 55 degrees, you want to bring them in. And also you'll read that the vine has to die completely. My vines never die completely. I think that's in other climates. So I bring them in in October. Some varieties need curing. If you've ever had a squash and you grew it and you're really proud of it and you tasted it and it was gross, if you had another one of those and before you cut into it, you can leave it at house temp from 2 to 4 weeks and see if it tastes better. So you can experiment with yours and see if they taste better fresh or stored. It's called curing. And some squash like that and some don't. And to reduce rot, you can wipe it down with a 10% bleach solution, especially around the base of the stem and anywhere that looks funky, like it has a little callus or something, or and on the bottom and things like that. Right now, you could also, if you can pick your squash up that you want to store, pick them up gently without detaching them. So it's kind of a stunt to do that, and slide like a dry board or something under them so they're not sitting in the mud. Sometimes that helps. Whoops, I forgot that I can't use my fingers the way I usually do. What else? Yeah, and then we're going to store them 55 to 65 in a dry, dark place. Darkness doesn't matter as much as for potatoes, but dry. This describes my garage. So if you have a garage, you've got a slab floor that really moderates the temperature. It doesn't heat up or cool down very fast. Of course, you want to keep the garage closed. What else? An outbuilding or shed, if it doesn't, if the temperature doesn't vary a whole lot, works out quite well. And I highly recommend the squash sweet meat. I guess I'll click on it and show you if I can. This squash, it's a giant rangy squash, so it needs 4 by 4 feet of root space. And then it goes on a travel as it grows, but I let it travel in places that I don't care about, like down the pathway and over the mulch and across the lawn that's dormant by then anyway. This squash keeps an incredibly long time, and it's incredibly delicious. You only get 2 per plant, but each one can be like 18 pounds. So I get 36 pounds of squash off that plant, and it's super, super great. Anyway, you don't have to do that though. You can do other ones. and here's your chart for curing. So this is in your resource page too. So the ones that need to be cured are only these. This is the time that you're supposed to cure them. So they recommend a month, or for some of them, more than that. So they're gonna taste better if you cure them. And sweetmeat is a Hubbard type. So I cure my sweetmeat, which makes the house look really darling because I've got these pumpkins all over it, but it's just functional. You see up here, it says red Hubbards, no curing. You just can eat them. And then this orange, darker orange, is how long you can expect to keep them. But the sweetmeats that I have, I sometimes have kept for a year. And Hubbards I have kept for a year. You have to get lucky. You have to check them. And you know, this one goes bad and you eat it. And this one looks like it might and you eat that. But there's usually one at the end that that's kept for a really long time. This said, I have a friend who is a farmer who does, he cures his acorn squash. Does anybody have experience with curing squash or not curing squash? I'm not hearing it. Okay. So that is in there anyway. Huh. Hold on. There we go. Okay. So what do you do with the stem? This is actually important. So you know pumpkins have really hard stems, and they often have sides, like 5 sides on the stem. So there's a 5-sided stem, and there's a 5-sided stem. And by the way, I think that this is like a zucchini. You eat this like a zucchini, and that is like a zucchini. But these two are not very closely related. This zucchini is more closely related to the ones in its column. These are all related, and these are all related, and they both have 5-sided stems, and you can leave them long. Just don't pick your squash up by the stem because you can break it off and then rot can get in. So don't knock them against each other. Don't store them where the stems are pressing against the body of another squash. But look at these over here. These are fleshy and cylindrical. These will rot. So you need to cut these 1/2 to 3/4 at the most long. So you cut them really short. And on this pumpkin especially, this is a sweetmeat squash, that's a little bit tricky. So I use pruners, and I even have to be careful that the pruner blades don't cut the squash because the squash kind of sticks up around the stem. So that is a tip that I learned after I had lots of squash rot right around here. It really helps. Oh, good. Terry says, I'm sure you're all looking at this. Cured Marina di Chioga tastes much better than uncured. Cool. Terry, is it one of your favorite squashes? Do you love it?
Yes, I love it. And I grow it every year.
Oh, that's really neat. And do you have a favorite source, or do you just get it from anywhere?
I get it from seeds from Italy.
Oh, okay. Very nice. And does it last? Does it save a really long time? Does it cellar well?
It lasts for many, many months.
Yay, that is great. And isn't it fun to have that? Like it's January, February, and you have this thing that you grew?
Yeah, it's great. And they're very sweet. They make excellent pies.
Oh, nice. Marina di Chioga. Could you just put Marina di Chioga in? Oh, you already did. You asked the question. I mean, you answered the question. Okay, thanks. Okay. Okay, oh, we're on to garlic. So there's a difference in storage ability depending on what kind of garlic you have. So these are not particular varieties of garlic. They're kind of subcategories of garlic. And the 3 on the right-hand side grow a stem in the middle that has a vestigial flower on it when they're growing. And the stem of that thing remains hard. So they're called hardnecks. After you harvest them, you won't be able to braid them. That's how you know you have a hardneck. And then there are others that don't do that. And so all you have is leaves, no stem. And those are called softnecks. And softnecks typically store longer. So I like hardnecks. I love hardnecks because they don't have little tiny bulbs in the middle. The one I grow is looks like this. It's got really big bulbs. It has a delicious flavor. But next year I am going to grow some soft necks because I think I want to try to store them longer. So what we can do is look for long storing garlic. And there's a resource, I think on the resource page for long storing garlic. This is a variety comparison chart. So you can see that it talks about how long it stores. And Creoles store a long time, but they're generally not available here because they're good for the southern US. But over here, silver skins are very good. And that, in fact, that's what the commercial growers usually use because they have to store them. And one that actually was bred up here in the Northwest and is very popular around here and is generally a big garlic. It's an artichoke type. It's called Enchilium red. So that's common around here. You can often get it at island nurseries, or you can mail order it. And do we know how to harvest garlic? I mean, you've already done it for this year probably, right? But maybe you're going to plant some this year and you're going to plant it in October. You're going to amend the bed, put the cloves in, and then it's going to just grow a little bit over winter. Are you going to throw some leaves on it so it doesn't, the ground doesn't freeze? You harvest with 5 to 6 green leaves. Some people go down to 4 green leaves. So the outer leaves are yellow, but 5 to 6 is good. And then you strip off 1 layer, if you can do it. You might have to do 2, but 1 is good, of the dirty leaves, and you end up with this clean garlic after you've harvested it. You do it immediately after you harvest it. And then you air dry it in the shade, totally, completely dry before you cut off the leaves. Because if you cut off the green leaves before they're totally dry all the way to the middle, then that is vascular tissue that will allow rot in. And I read that you should keep the stems a ½ inch or longer so they don't dry out. I just do that, but I didn't realize that there was a reason for it. It likes to be in the dark at 55 to 65 degrees. Lower than 50, it tends to sprout, which seems weird because it's colder. But also if the temp goes 40, 60, 40, 60, it will think it's been through spring and it's time to grow. So it's good to try to keep it in a place that's fairly stable. And I have a thermometer in my garage. And it's not as variable as you might think in there. But I do recommend getting a thermometer or moving one from somewhere else into your garage and just checking out different places. Especially an instant read one is pretty good. I have read that the small and medium-sized bulbs store longer. I don't have experience with that because my bulbs don't vary in size very much. Does anybody, if you have small and medium-sized bulbs store longer, would you let us know either in the chat or by hollering? But this last thing is alternatively, either when you think your garlic's going to sprout because it always sprouts every March, or you just don't want to store it anymore in the garage or whatever, you can freeze whole cloves. You can peel them and you can cut the bottoms off, you know, the root end off the cloves, not the head. You want to separate the cloves and then you cut the bottoms off. And then you can put them in a big jar and shake them really hard, and that loosens the peels. It'll even take some of the peels off and then take the peels off the rest of them, and just put them in a bag or spread them on a sheet pan and freeze them, and then put them in a Ziploc bag. And that is kind of nice to have that in the winter because you just think you've just saved yourself a step in cooking nutritious meals. So that's handy. And people even who buy a lot of garlic from Betsy Whittick at Laughing Crow, who grows a lot of island garlic, she'll encourage them to just buy a lot of garlic and then freeze it. Onions. You can get long storing varieties. Here are 2. Oh, where is that? Okay. Okay. Patterson is a long storing variety, and Newburgh is a long storing variety. Long storing onions are not the thick, juicy, layered onions, but they're thinner, they have less moisture, and they have more sulfur. So they're not the incredibly sweet ones. Patterson is a hybrid, so you have to buy the seed for it. And I bought some just to try it. And I planted it last year and I harvested it last probably August, September. Can you see my little picture of me? This is a Patterson that I planted not this past April, the April before that. And I harvested not this July, but last July, August, probably August, September. So they didn't all store this long, but a couple of them stored a really long time. So that's an amazing storage onion. And it's just in my garage. If you don't want to you want to do one where you can, it's open pollinated, then Newburgh is another one that looks just like Patterson. And it has been bred by Alan Capular, who is a brilliant breeder for the Northwest. So do we all know this? I could skip this. I'll try to go fast, I guess. So when they begin to fall over, you haven't done anything wrong. You just stop watering because they're telling you that they're done. When half the stems have fallen over, you shove the rest of them down. And then you can grab the stem. I leave them in the ground, but I'm not watering. And I'm leaving them for a few days until I can grab the base of the stem above the onion and pinch it and slide my fingers back and forth like that. And it'll roll, it'll slip. It's not rigid. I'm not going like this, it'll slide against each other itself. And then I pull them out. You can leave them in the sun for a day or two, or you can put them directly into a well-ventilated dry shade. So we don't want moisture on them. And we wait for them to dry forever. We wait for a really long time for them to dry, like weeks. And then you cut off the leaves and the roots. The roots are just at the base. So this is actually not a root. These are leaf bases. But when this is completely dry, all the way to the middle, you can cut it. And the roots, you can cut off the roots as well. I just cut them off, just trim them off. Don't cut the onion, just because it's cleaner in the kitchen. And they love 33 degrees Fahrenheit, right? But I don't have 33 degrees Fahrenheit. So I put them in the coolest part of my garage. You can do it in a mesh bag. I do mine I think mine are in wire baskets with ventilation all the way around. And this one has been just, how your garage is. This one has just been at garage temp for a really long time. And it's been fine. I will say a lot of varieties will sprout in April. And that is when, if you have a lot of onions, I'm going to make a suggestion in the freezing section about that. But there are varieties, if you have 20 onions left, they are going to sprout in April, but you've done a really good job because you've got those onions all the way from last August or September all the way to April. And don't store them with potatoes or other root crops that are giving moisture off. These onions want to be dry. Oh, and I have to think about are you thinking about, but mine are going to get mice? So you could put a pole or a really tight wire or hooks in your garage way up high and put bags of things in plastic bags. It only just occurred to me the other day that a traditional thing that hangs above the counter, is probably an anti-mouse thing for produce. I thought that was kind of clever of them. I have wire shelves. They seem pretty hard for mice to climb. So my produce is up here. I also have one of these specifically from the days when I didn't really think about plastic enough, 25 years ago, 30 years ago. But it has been pretty hard for mice to climb. And these these metal cabinets show up, if you have a really bad problem, they show up on Craigslist quite often. Okay, so we're moving on to freezer. Does anybody have anything that's not freezer related that you want to say or ask? Okay. Okie doke. So you don't have to just shove things in a bag, because sometimes they'll freeze all together in a big mass in a bag, right? But we can individually freeze them on a sheet pan. And for veg, it's really good to blanch them first. You can do that with a big pot of boiling water and you just put them in for a few minutes. You can also do that with steam. So you don't have to heat that big pot of water up. And that is usually appropriate for vegetables, but it's not necessary for fruit. And I have in the resource page a guide for freezing veg, or a link to freezing veg. And if you don't see one of these links, you can let us know at the end and I'll make sure that it's on there. And then you freeze on wax paper or parchment covered sheet pan. And then after they're frozen, because they were individually frozen, they froze faster, and that makes smaller ice crystals. If you're freezing something in a big pile, they're going to freeze slowly and the ice crystals are bigger and it makes them mushier. I'm not saying your green beans are going to be like fresh off the vine, but a fistful of green beans is a great thing that goes into my minestrone that's made of lots of other stuff from my garden. So I can make this, you can make this big, great minestrone in the middle of winter. And the green beans are a good component, I would say. So I don't freeze a whole lot of veg, but I do greens that are bolting or, extra green beans and things like that. Okay. Okay. I do this a lot and I will advocate it. My teenager calls them food units and I call them pucks. So right here, over here, the chard decided to bolt. And I thought, oh, I've got tomatoes, I've got zucchinis coming out my ears. I don't want to deal with chard, making a chard meal and having chard in the fridge. So I grabbed the chard and I washed it off while a big pan was heating, an empty pan. And then I threw it in the empty pan and put the lid on and pulled the lid off and flipped it over and waited 1 more minute. And then I spread it out on a sheet pan. And when it was fairly cool, I smashed it into these cupcake pans. Into this cupcake pan. This is a stainless steel cupcake pan because it doesn't react, but you could also find, these are kind of hard to find, but you can also find silicone cupcake pans and little cake pans, little square bakers, all these multi-bake things, and they're in the thrift stores. And I've seen reports from people who are trying to find out if there's anything wrong with silicone, like is it bad for us? And they're really not able to find anything. The only thing about silicone pans is you should put them in a sheet pan before you fill them because they're floppy. And so then you get these pucks, and if it's a green or something that is not oily, then I just put it in a Ziploc bag. And then in the middle of winter, again, this is another component in the minestrone soup. Or if I want to make a lasagna, I don't have to do the step in the lasagna that says wash, blanch, cool, and squeeze dry the chard, right? It's just there. So I can just drop these things in and I just thaw this and then I squeeze it really hard. For those things that are water-based, I put them in a Ziploc bag. For oil-based stuff, I put it in jars. And this is not a quart jar, and it's also not a pint jar, but you see that it's totally straight up and down. It accommodates the pucks, and this is actually a 1.5 pint jar. So it has no shoulders. It's really wide mouth. And then I just write on the lid what's in there. And then this is looking in the drawer of my freezer, or you can use a bin or something. But these are all, they're all labeled. And yeah, it's a very convenient way to have a lot of really good stuff. So I have a pesto base here, but this has much less oil than my pesto recipe calls for and no cheese, because I can do the oil and cheese. I always have that around. So I can just thaw that later. So we have it on pizzas and on pasta and on fish and on potatoes. It's really good. You can do a red pepper pesto. I have like 12 pounds of red peppers waiting for that. And I just made baba ganoush. And you might think, oh, that's such a lot of faff. But that is one session to make all the pesto for the year. So it's not more than, making pesto or making some other pepper sauce. You have this made and you can make these dinners if you're a busy person or you are trying to eat healthy and it's kind of hard to go through all those steps in the middle of winter every night. This is great for that. If you have hungry teenagers and you really want the family to eat together, something that doesn't come out of a Stover's box, it's really great for that. So I'm a big fan. Oh, and this is what I do with my onions when they're bolting. I just set aside a little bit of time and I caramelize them, and you think, oh, that is so fancy and it takes so long and you have to stand around for 35 minutes. But you've done it, and then you have it for all these other dishes that you put on pasta and in eggs and a thin crust pizza with sliced Bosc pear and a little bit of gorgonzola. I recommend it highly. And those are things that you then have access to for later. Cooked squash is great. I chunk the squash up into 3x4 pieces of squash, and I do not put it face down. I put it face up. I do want my squash to dry out and caramelize a little bit. It doesn't dry out much, but it's just not really wet. And it gets brown on the edges, 375 for like somewhere between 40 minutes and an hour and a half. And then I let it cool a little bit and I scoop it directly off the squash, off the skin, into an ice cream scoop. An ice cream scoop is a half cup. And I level it if it's level, and then put it on a sheet pan and freeze it. And those you can make really fast butternut squash soup or whatever squash soup. If you have a big squash, you've grown yourself a big squash. You don't have to eat that whole thing all at once. You can freeze part, cook it all and freeze part of it, and then have soup. You can put it in a lasagna, because wouldn't squash lasagna be great? Except I have to roast a squash first. It's already done. If you have little kids and you want to get more squash in them, I've got muffin recipes. There are cornbread recipes, all kinds of stuff. So all of this is pretty usable and really actually increases your options and reduces your work overall. Because I can make chili from this kind of stuff or a soup from this in like 15 minutes. So it's pretty great. Anybody want to say anything about that? Okay.
It sounds yummy.
Oh, thanks, John. This was a bad plum year for a lot of people. If you had a great Italian plums supply this year, please text us. We would all like to come have some. But this is a great thing to do with Italian plums as well, and probably you could do with other fruit. Yeah, I'm going to think about that. I bet you could. This is a slightly almondy flavored cake, although you can leave out the almond extract and it won't be. That's great for Italian plums. It's really famous. It was originally a New York Times recipe. And I put 2 links for it. One is New York Times and one is Cooks Illustrated, where they kind of improve the plums a little bit. But then you cool these things. You've used up your plums, like you can make a bunch of them. And my recipe that I use uses the food processor. So it's really fast and clean. And you've made them, you cool them, you put parchment around them and wrap that in foil. And you can freeze them and then you can stack them in your freezer. And a new neighbor moves in, you have to go to a party, you spontaneously want dessert one night. You have these there and it's really great. They're available. Has anybody made the Italian plum cake? Nope. Anyway, I think they're great and I put 2 recipes in. And
We
don't just store them.
dehydrate-
Oh, sorry?
We dehydrate our Italian plums, split them and pit them, and then
Oh
just
my
lay them in
gosh.
the dehydrator. And if you get to that just perfect moisture content,
Yeah.
oh my goodness, they are like a candy bar. They're so sweet.
Aren't they fantastic? Yeah, and did you get an okay crop this year or not?
No, I ended up with aphids, an infestation that took over about half the tree. And so I went out several times with a high pressure hose and blew them all off. But in doing so, I blew a lot of the plums off as well.
Mm.
If I get 24 plums off that tree, I'll be surprised. Whereas
Yeah, it wasn't a good year for
pounds and
them.
pounds. Yeah.
Right, right. I don't know if anybody has this problem, but I not with plum, yeah, actually with plums sometimes, but I will have a crop or a big squash. And every year I used to think, oh, how am I using this again? Okay, let me think. I could make this for dinner. I could make that for dinner. And I got tired of reinventing this list every year. So I started just jotting it down and then I actually put it in a doc. So this isn't a public dock, but you think about it if you have a big garden, or if you frequently come up against having extra produce, like a lot of winter squash or all of your spinach is bolting. I just wrote what it was, and then all the ideas I could think of how to use it. And often there are ideas that use other things that are ripe at the same time. And it's from past experience. So when I can't think of, how to use that thing up, I just look back at this document. So that actually is an extra step for you, but you could do it. You can also dry them out. So we've done in the garden, in the fridge, in the freezer, and now you can dry them. And I'm not going to do a full tutorial on drying stuff, but I'm going to point you to some resources. And maybe John can tell us about drying things out too. Let me see where we're going with this. Okay. You do not have to have a dehydrator to dry stuff. You might eventually want one, but they're bulky and you can do quite a bit of good stuff with your oven. So check these out. Okay, these are the best things that you can dehydrate. Maybe also the Italian plum prints. Yeah, and John, John, if you have other ideas, or if anybody else has your favorite thing to dehydrate, let us know. But if you have any way to cut root vegetables to 1/16 of an inch thick, and you want to get a ruler and look at the ruler and go, oh yeah, that's what 1/16 of an inch thick is. If you have a way to do that, parsnip chips are really good, and so are beet chips. And let me tell you why parsnip chips are good, because any chip takes all the nutrients, including the sugar, and shrinks it down into half the size. So it's really concentrated flavor. When I do parsnip chips, I don't cut them across like this. I cut them lengthwise because my parsnips are huge. They're like a leg of lamb or something. And I want to avoid the core, which can be tough and taste a little bit soapy to me. So I actually cut them into chunks and then cut it lengthwise until I come up to the core, and then I rotate it and keep cutting. Beets the same way, but you don't have to rotate or avoid the core. They are so delicious. And there is a link to a document with a specific recipe for how to do it. It's for beets, but you can also do it with parsnips. And then you can find recipes for kale chips all over the place. It's basically strip them off the stems, rub them with olive oil and salt, and roast them. The higher temp you roast them, the more likely they are to burn. So we've learned to drop the temperature a little bit. But black kale, lacinato, or dinosaur, that's all the same kind of kale. And it makes the best. Oh, that's a good question, Anna. Where are these things? Go up to the top of the chat, and there's a link to the resource page. And you can do apple as well. You want to slice them thin. And apple chips are actually a really good, let me go here. They're a great use for naturally soft apples. Like you think, oh, these don't keep very long and they're kind of puffy when you eat them. They're not very juicy, or they get soft really easily. If they're naturally soft, they're actually better dryers. They're better for drying. An apple peeler slicer makes really consistent slices. These show up in the thrift stores a lot, especially if you go to the big one in Silverdale, the big Goodwill. You want to make sure all the parts are in the box though. A mandolin, if you have a little simple mandolin, or a super sharp knife. So it's probably about 1/8 of an inch thick when I do it. They should be soaked after you've sliced them and cored them. They should be soaked in vitamin C. And there's a link I have 2 links, and one's for drying vegetables and one's for drying fruit. And that's in the resource pages. And it tells you how much to use. You can buy powdered vitamin C, or you can smash up tablets. Buying the powdered stuff is a lot less of hassle, but it's hard to find around town. So you might want to mail order that. And you dip them, and you just put them in for 10 minutes, because 10 minutes has the maximum effect with the least amount of smushiness. That does 2 things. It reduces browning, but frankly, they're going to brown anyway. And it also kills some bacteria. We don't care if they're harmless bacteria or even good bacteria, but some harmful ones require that vitamin C soak. And you can do it at 170 in your oven or whatever your lowest temp is in your oven. You want to oil the racks that they're on. Like if you use cake racks on top of a sheet pan, you want to oil that. And it says or turn when leathery. I probably would turn them when they're, even if they're oiled, I might turn them when they're leathery, because if you wait until they're really brittle or quite brittle and they're stuck to the rack, it's a mess to get them off and they'll break. And I like to cook them long enough for them to get like shatteringly crisp, but you don't have to do that. You can have them when they're just chewy, but they're super popular when they're shatteringly crisp. And you can't tell if they're shatteringly crisp when they're hot. So you reach in and you pull one out and you go like this and you try to like cool it off all the way. And then you see if it just snaps. You don't have to do that. But if you put them then into small jars, like Talenti jars, which you can get from your neighbors, because every other household has a bad Talenti habit and they want to just get the evidence out of their house as quickly as possible. So they will give you these jars and you put those in as soon as they're cool, put them in while they're crispy, put the lid on really tight. And then you will have this crunchy snack that you can give to friends or your kids or whatever. If you put them in a giant jar, then every time you open it, moist air comes in and they'll soften up. And they're still good. You do not have to, again, you don't have to get them dry enough to be crisp, but they are fun. And yeah, do look at the drying guide though, because it tells you how to know if they're dry enough, because if they are too moist, they will mold. So you pull things apart and you look at the inside, you scrunch them together and see if they'll fall apart. And you also do something called conditioning, where if they're crispy dry, you don't have to condition them. But if they're leathery dry, or any fruit like the plums that John dries, you put them in a jar and just leave the jar there for a couple of days. And then you look, and if there's condensation inside the jar, that means you didn't dry them enough and you need to do it again. Let's see.
Anna had a question about apples in her crisper.
Cool. Yeah, I've done that. Would they be any good? You know, they're pretty good. I can't speak for your particular apples. But I'd give it a go. Yeah, give it a try. And let's see. Oh yeah, no Talenti jars in the dishwasher. Yes, is that because the bottom bows, or is it because it's bad for you?
If they're heated, they warp and you get interesting shapes.
Yeah, right. The bottom bows for mine. Right. That's a great thing. Thank you for telling us about that. Yeah. Oh, you can also dry them in a dehydrator. This is a big, expensive dehydrator. It comes under a bunch of different names. One of them is Excalibur. It's got stainless steel racks, which I really like. You can get dehydrators with plastic racks. It's whether you want stainless steel, it's a personal preference. But you can look up reviews for dehydrators, and even these expensive ones show up on Craigslist. So you can find them. You have to keep an eye out though, but I would start in the oven and then decide if I really want to adopt that dehydrator lifestyle. So here's one, but it's not near us, it's in Monroe. But they can go like for $300-400 new. But you can also get one like this, it's much less expensive. And you can also check eBay. Okay. Let's see. Should we take a 5-minute break? Or do we want to, yeah? Okay, we're gonna take a 5-minute break. We're gonna be back here at 8:20.
How much content do we have left?
I have a lot of content.
Okay, so we should probably take a break then.
Okay. Okay, see you at 8:20. You want to know about the National Center for Home Food Preservation, which was created because we don't want people poisoning themselves making jam wrong and things like that. So it has, how do I, and it says ferment, dry, can, all these things. And then under canning, it says tomato products, and then it has every tomato product you can think of. And it has recipes that will allow you to be successful with it, and you will not poison yourself. So they even have guides on drying. So I put 2 guides, one on drying fruit and one on drying vegetables, in the resource page. And I just wanted you to know about that. And that is good for winter recipes when you think, why did I freeze that many blackberries? Or what am I going to do with all these tomatoes so I can eat them in the wintertime? So lots of good guidance there. And let me think here. Okay, I'm going to give you this one. I was going to skip it, but if you want to feel like a real squirrel, speaking of storing things in the winter, these are 2 specifically Northwest adapted varieties. These were bred for the Northwest, and these are English, and they just do very well here. We need things that are tolerant of cool weather and that mature quickly. So we can't grow the biggest corn and expect it to dry all the way. So we have to grow particularly adapted ones. And these are fantastic. The beans, I would say, are simpler because they're little. You just plant them like regular beans, but they all mature at the same time. All the beans on every plant, and they're a tiny bush thing. They're like maybe 14 inches tall, and all the beans are set and dried. If you plant them, I think if you plant them like end of April, beginning of May, they're dry before our rains start, typically. If it doesn't happen, they're so short, you can throw a little tunnel over the top and keep them dry so that they can dry out the rest of the way. So when you want just for the beans to be mature and the husks, the pods, to be yellow and withering. It'd be great if they were crispy dry, but if not, just pull them all and put them off in a dry place and they can dry out. And then you can just eat dried beans over winter. And you want to dry them extra after you get them out of the hulls. You dry them on sheet pans or something. And you can seed save those as well. And we'll talk about seed saving in a few minutes. The thing on the left is Cascade Ruby Gold. It is such an amazing corn. It was specially bred by Carol Deppy, who lives in Corvallis, Oregon. And she's a geneticist and a subsistence food grower. And you can grind it up if you have a Vitamix with a grain pitcher. You can dry this and grind it up, and it makes polenta and it makes cornmeal for cornbread and stuff like that. So it's pretty fun. But that's kind of like for extreme storage gardeners, but they're both really cool. Oh, we're going to talk seed saving, a little bit of seed saving. But before we talk seed saving, does anybody have any storage questions? I'm not looking at the chat, so let me see. There it is. Does anybody want to say anything out loud? You don't just want to be silent and texting or typing? Okay, it sounds like we're okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about seed saving, because I'm putting this in because it was a topic that a lot of people said they were interested in, storing food and saving seed. So I want to say that traditional seed saving is a very highly refined craft. You could call it a science. You can call it a skill. It involves maintaining huge populations of food plants. So this guy has this field, but this is a Hopi man, but other Hopi people have other fields, and other people who are growing corn have other fields. So it's a giant gene pool, which is great. We love a big gene pool because maybe hiding in that gene pool is a gene for extra drought resistance or moisture resistance or bacterial resistance or some other resistance that will make them more adaptable. So we love to have lots and lots of plants. And this guy also has skills that have been passed on forever in recognizing that this plant right here has a leaf shape that tells me that this plant's going to create corn that does not store well. And that one over there, that one's bad for another reason. It's not mildew resistant or something. So he's going to do what's called roguing, and he walks through the field and he kills those plants before they can produce pollen. So that involves a lot of knowledge, right? Because he has to know how the corn seed is going to be based on what the plant looks like. So it's a really highly refined skill. You don't have to have it in order to save seed. But when we think about plant diversity, if you're thinking about it on a bigger, saving the world through seed diversity issue, it's not just you and me saving seed as individuals from one tomato plant. But if a lot of us do it, then we do preserve some of that diversity, but also these traditional ways of doing things preserve a lot of the diversity. So I have for you 3 plants that you can save a seed from, and a book that you can read if you want, a couple of books actually, if you want to understand, get into seed saving more. Let me look here. So we don't have to have giant fields. We can save a few plants. And what we're going to do from doing that is we're going to constrict the biodiversity, the genetic diversity in the population, but we're still going to be able to have some tomatoes that we can grow that are the same as the tomatoes that we grew last year or similar. What else? Oh, plants. When we're thinking about, how natural plants are, are they open pollinated or something? I want to tell you, vegetables are not really natural. That thing in the middle, wild mustard, is the natural form. Nature has put pressure on that population. And the form in the middle, I'm going to say, is the one that sets seed early enough and resists mildew and is drought tolerant enough to get babies for the next year, to produce babies for the next year. But we have taken it and we've said, we don't want the babies. We don't want it to be drought tolerant. We'll give it extra water. We want to make all these other plants out of it. And we've done that by, frankly, genetically modifying it, but it's not genetic engineering. We have just found one in the field, or several in the field, that had really good terminal buds. That's right here. And they didn't flower. They just held that terminal bud closed, and we turned it into a cabbage. And we found ones that had fantastically big flower clusters, and we bred them with each other. We saved those seeds and we just bred them with each other so that flower clusters developed. And that's how we got cauli and broccoli. So each of these things we've selected, we have manipulated the plants by breeding just the ones that we wanted, and we got these different populations. So it's like all these different varieties are all the same genus and species. They're like different dog breeds, kind of. Let's look. So we're going to do a little bit of seed saving. So we're going to look at the difference between open pollinated and hybrid. If you want to seed save, you need an open pollinated plant. That means that all of its all of the plants like that will produce seed that is like themselves. It's like a purebred animal. It's like a purebred poodle. You breed 2 poodles together and you get another poodle, and it looks just like those poodles. And we've been so careful with poodles that we always get a dog that looks like a poodle. You don't suddenly get a basset. A hybrid seed is a labradoodle. It has 2 different parents, and they come out with some great qualities, right? We like those hybrid qualities in labradoodle. We love hybrid qualities in people. We don't want people who look exactly like their parents, and we know that diseases can even spring up when you inbreed dogs or people. So we like that. You know how mutts have a lot of less health problems than some purebred strains that have been overbred? Well, plants can have that too if they are too tightly bred. But an open pollinated one is a very purebred plant. So we want those open pollinated ones if we're going to save seed. Another disadvantage of hybrid is you can't take a tomato seed off of a hybrid plant and plant it and get exactly that, because it's like breeding Labradoodles together. Those puppies that come out might be more like one parent, like the Labrador side, or more like the poodle side. So you plant a hybrid seed, it may not come out exactly like the parent. In fact, it probably won't. I have a lot of hybrids that I like to use, and I don't object to them, but I do like that you can save seed on open pollinated plants. So that's something you're going to look for. Yeah, that's, I'm going to skip the other bits of vocabulary. So here are the basics. Save seed from multiple plants of the same variety. So not just one plant. It's good if you're saving lettuce to save seed from multiple plants of the same variety, because if you save just from one of them, then you could get viable seed. There are many people who just save from one lettuce plant and they get viable seed the next year. But it's good to have more than one, because they will then have cross-pollinated and they've created some variety in the gene pool. And some kinds of plants, if they don't have the genetic variety, then the offspring are not as vigorous. They don't grow as well. So if you can save from multiple plants, give that a try, like 5 plants. But if you can't, you can also experiment with just doing it from one. The 3 that I'm giving you tonight, often you can still maintain viable offspring from saving from one plant, but it's better to do more than one. Let the seeds mature completely. So I'll show you what that's like for each of them. And then we're going to do something called threshing and something called winnowing, or wet processing, to get the seeds out. And then we're going to let them dry again, longer than you'd think. It needs to be warm, dry, and out of the sun. It needs to be under 95 degrees though. So we don't want to like bake them in the oven. You can store them then, but at this point, if they're just dried indoors, you store them in breathable paper envelopes in a cool, dry place, but not the fridge and not the freezer, unless you've done some extra special steps. So you can just put them in. We want them to be able to be in those breathable envelopes, and hopefully in a place that's quite dry and quite cool. You can freeze them. 2 reasons. One is that you can store them for years if they're in the freezer. And people like that if they're sort of prepping for emergency stores. You can also kill potential insect eggs, but you have to dry them to shatter. So that means, here's how you know if they're dried to shatter. You take a bean and you put it on a rock, a flat rock, and you hit it with a hammer. And if it breaks and it goes and just sort of spreads out, that is not shatter. If it breaks and sort of explodes in pieces outward and they just fly, that thing has shattered. So you get the idea? Well, you have to have them that dry, because when you freeze, water expands, and it expands in pointy little crystals. And if you freeze a bean before it's shatter dry, it'll break the cells and it won't be viable. So that usually requires a dehydrator, and it usually should be under 90 degrees, definitely under 95. And if you're doing it in your dehydrator because you're right out there on the advanced edge of gardening, you should put a thermometer in the dehydrator to make sure that when the dehydrator says that it's set to 90, that it's actually 90, because even the really expensive ones, the thermostats are not that accurate. So you want to check. Okay. So one of the things that you can save if you want to do beginning seed saving is beans and peas. And here's why you can do that. Can you see the pollen or stigma or style? You know, all those pollen receiving parts and the pollen making parts. Can you see those on that flower? I'm going to guess no. It's because they're all enclosed and they don't even come out. And they don't come out. What happens because of that is they self-pollinate just inside the flower. So that plant pollinates itself. usually before you see anything that comes out. So I'm not talking about runner beans. Runner beans are often insect pollinated. And I'm not talking about fava beans, which are actually, yeah, they're more like a pea, but they are also typically insect pollinated. I'm talking about string bean, snap bean, Italian wax. Vortex is a great variety. It's open pollinated. It's very forgiving. It's a really robust plant. If you should, I don't have that in the resources, so you should write this word down if you want to check out Vortex green beans. That's for fresh beans, if you want to breed your own fresh beans. If you want a seed save for dry beans, early Warwick bean, which is the one that I showed you already, with the corn and the chili bean and saying you could grow them for yourself. And Titus cannellini, specifically just Titus, because Titus is really fast around here. So you're going to pick a lot of beans. You're picking beans from your green beans. You don't pick them for your dry beans, but you're picking green beans. And then you've picked plenty of green beans. And then you say, the rest of these, I'm going to let go to seed because I'm going to save seed. And you want to pick pods from different plants if you can, when they're at least leathery and withering and tan. But if it starts pouring rain, you may not get them to dry all the way to crunchy crisp, right? It would be great if they dried to crunchy crisp on the plant, but here it often rains early. And if the pods are just leathery and it's raining on them, that can mildew. So we want to pick them and get them out of there. And then you're going to dry until they're very hard. So the pods are going to go hard. And then when the pods are crunchy, you can snap them out with your hands and get the beans out and lift out the pods and dry the beans until they're very hard. And then store them in a cool, dark, breathable envelope. And yep, you have to dry them to shatter if you want to freeze them to kill bug eggs. I don't typically have problems with bug eggs, but it can happen. Let's see, is there anything else? I think that's it. So does anybody have questions about peas and beans? Okay, I'm going to tell you about winnowing later, and you might have to use winnowing for peas or beans. You can also do it for tomatoes. So definitely choose an open pollinated variety of tomato and pick very ripe fruit, ideally from several plants of the same variety. And then you have to do this thing called fermentation, because tomato seeds are in this gel, and the gel has the property of inhibiting the growth of the tomato seed. So you have to do fermentation. I'll show that in a minute. And we're going to dry them very thoroughly, and then we're going to store them in paper envelopes. Not so hard. Well, look at this. This is fermentation. So you've got a tomato, super ripe, and you squeeze the gel out of it and you eat the rest of it. So the gel and the seeds are now in a cup and the seeds float. Actually, this is pretty tidy looking. It's usually quite a mess. But if you don't have a full inch of liquid, which you probably won't, at least an inch to 2 inches, you're going to add water, preferably non-chlorinated water if you can, and stir it up. And then you leave it on the counter. And you're going to let it rot, basically. It's going to get mold. It's going to smell funny. It's going to bubble. And you can stir it. And a few days later, and it really depends, it could be a week later, it's going to look like this. So the seeds have sunk to the bottom. That means the gel on the seeds has been decomposed eaten off of the seeds. And then you pour the stuff off, and you dump them in some kind of rinsing device like a sieve, and then you spread them out and you dry them. I usually put them on a towel and dry them, and then scrape them off that towel onto another dry towel to dry the rest of the way. And you just let them dry in a warm, dark place with good air circulation. Does anybody have a question about? Oh, I see. Terry's asking about beans. Sorry, Terry, I didn't see that earlier. If two different beans are growing next to each other, will the seeds saved be true to the variety planted? So Carol Deppy is a geneticist and a plant breeder, and she says if they actually come in physical contact with each other, they might cross, but it doesn't happen super often. Sometimes something good happens from that if they do cross. In fact, she had some, she developed some varieties that came from those kinds of crosses. So if they're just next to each other, it's probably not a problem because they are not generally getting insect pollinated or wind pollinated. So plants can be pollinated, self-pollinated like beans, or insect pollinated. We know how that works, or wind pollinated like corn makes a big cloud of pollen and it just floats around and it pollinates all the rest of the corn. So does spinach. So we're not doing insect pollinated stuff or wind pollinated stuff because it gets more complicated. Yeah. So they could cross, but they probably won't. We can also do, I'm going to stick with tomatoes for a second and see if I can find this. No, I'm not. Never mind. We can also do lettuce. This is what lettuce looks like when it goes to flower. Doesn't it look like weeds that you've seen like on the roadside? You know why? Because there's a lot of wild lettuce on the roadside. A lot of our weeds, not all of them, but quite a few of them, are wild lettuces. So, of course, you want to pick open pollinated varieties. And if you can, let several plants go to flower. That will increase probably the germination rate of your next generation and the vigor of it. And we want to pick them off before the rains cause them to mildew. So do you see that there are buds here that haven't even opened? And some buds that are probably closed, and there are flowers that are just getting pollinated, and then there are these fuzzy things. So right here, these are the lettuce seeds. They're kind of like thistle down seeds that have the little parachute. So typically what people do is they pick some of these off or all of them off and put them in a bag every time they go buy their lettuce, every time they're out there working. And then when it starts to rain, they just have to sacrifice the rest of it. And you dry thoroughly and you rub them between your fingers to get the down off of them and get them seeds separated if you can. So that's what the seeds end up looking like. And you're gonna have to winnow. You might have to winnow some of these things. So threshing is when you separate it from the pod or the seed head or whatever. That's threshing. So you're doing that by breaking the beans out of the seeds, by rubbing the lettuce seeds, by breaking the beans out of the pods. But then you have to winnow. Oh yeah, by the way, sorry, I'm going to back up. These are wild lettuces. At least these two are. This person says this is a wild lettuce, but I'm not so sure about it. So it says some plants cross with wild neighbors because usually lettuces are not, they're usually self-pollinating. They can cross with wild neighbors, but they don't usually unless they're really close. Carol Deppy claims that they do, but yeah, but most people say that they don't usually have a problem with that. So anyway, back to winnowing. Winnowing is when you take the chaff, which is the bits of straw-like stuff that are not seeds, that come along with your seeds, and the seeds. So they're all up here. The chaff and the seeds are up here. And then she has the wind blowing either away from her or across. And she's pouring down the seed. And the seed is heavy, so it all ends up in one spot. And the chaff, which is husks here, blow away. So that is how you winnow. You can also winnow, I would put, if I were new to this, I would put the stuff in a really big bowl and then go out on a breezy day and just pick it up about a foot and drop it and just get used to how it works, because sometimes the seeds blow away if you do it too high. Or you can put it in a smaller, a medium, like a salad bowl, and just blow on it and it'll blow. You can certainly, pull the big stuff out, but blow on it and it will sometimes blow the chaff out over the edge. You can use a fan if you have a lot, but usually people don't have enough that they need to use a fan. So the easiest to save are, again, the peas, beans, tomatoes, and lettuce. And coriander you can save. Sometimes the viability of the seed really drops if you just have one plant. So it's good to have a bunch of plants that you let go to seed. Coriander is the seed of cilantro, and cilantro loves to go to seed, right? So do more than one plant if you're letting it go to seed so that they can cross-pollinate. It's more challenging to do brassicas. Here it says more challenging are outcrossers because brassicas are insect pollinated and they love to trade pollen. So a kale will trade with a Brussels sprout. And in fact, I think that's how they got those things called kalettes, which is a new plant. But they cross-pollinate all the time. And wind pollinated ones like spinach and corn are for a more advanced technique. Yeah. And carrots will even breed with wild carrots nearby. You know what Queen Anne's lice is? That is a wild carrot. So those are our starters: beans, peas, tomatoes, and lettuces. Does anybody have a really old variety of tomato, or one that you know to be crossed back to a wild tomato? Anybody have that? Some of those have a flower structure that is not self-pollinating. And so some old varieties and semi-wild varieties have that tendency to outcross. So they might cross with other tomatoes. This is a great book. I have to say, I have seen books in various places that have a lot of erroneous information in them. I'm not an expert, but I do know some of it, and I know some of what I've seen is not very accurate. They'll say that a hybrid plant is a genetically modified, genetically engineered, dangerous plant. Hybrids have disadvantages, like I personally don't get to seed save from them, and they can be patented sometimes. So, or I can't remember what it's called, variety protection. It's not really a patent. So that's something that's not good, but they're not breeding them intentionally to make them sterile. They're not sterile. They just don't breed true. They make babies that don't look like them. But this plant is this book rather is very detailed, but you can read like the first half of it and you can use the charts and things. This is a really nice book about growing, saving your own seed. And thank you for putting that link in, John, because I don't think I have it in the resource page. It's a big book, but it's a great explanation. You know what, another one, I don't know if the library has it. It's by Carol Deppy, and it's called Breed Your Own Vegetable Varieties. And I don't know that I would, expect you to breed your own vegetable varieties, but she's very good at describing. She's a very folksy, understandable way of describing how plants breed and what inbreeding and outcrossing and self-pollination is. That's even better than this one. This one uses a lot of vocabulary but you kind of have to build your vocabulary when you're reading this one because they use a lot of jargon. So they're both really good books, though. Oh yeah, this is a simple one. I forgot to turn this into a slide. But John, can you check? I think this one is in the resource page. And the Seed Ambassadors has this really old, it's a PDF. It's a really old, I'll put it in if it's not there. It's like a zine from like the 80s or something. And it's just a simple how to save seeds and a simple explanation. So I think if you're just starting and you want to read one, that is a great resource. Do I need to put it in later, John? Everybody can check back. Hard to find. Yeah, okay. Yes, I do. Okay. So that's the end of seed saving. Does anybody want to ask any questions or tell me that I was wrong about stuff, because it's called Veg Club and you can certainly do that? Please, because gardeners are always doing that, right? Like, that never works for me. This is the way you should do it. Okay, well, I am going, if you think of anything, put it in the chat or say you want to get called on or just start yelling, and I'd love to hear it. there is so much good stuff coming up. So another way that I didn't cover in class, another way to preserve stuff, which is fantastic and easier than you would think, and really satisfying, is fermentation. And this is natural fermentation. So we're not putting vinegar on something. We are inviting the stuff, the critters that are already on the vegetables, to create, instead of acetic acid, which is vinegar, we're inviting them to create lactic acid and maybe some other acids. And it is delicious. And so this is a field trip. It's free, but you have to register. So the registration link is it should be in the resource page. I was a little busier than usual this time for the resource page, but if it's not there, I'll put it in. Yeah, and it's on our usual day, which would be the second Tuesday. So it's on October 11th, but look, the time is different. So it's not 7, it starts at 5. And it's in the barn from Kitchen Arts Room, and the barn is an amazing place. So it's a great way to see inside the barn. Which is Bainbridge Area Resource Network, Artisan Resource Network, Bainbridge Artisan Resource Network. And you can watch previous Veg Club sessions. So this is also in the resource page. And you can find out about the hoop houses here, and you can find out about what to plant and when to plant it in the June class. And yeah, those are great. And what else? Oh, we're also going to tour Vireo Farm. This is not a Veg Club thing, but this is part of Bainbridge Prepares, and Kitsap Libraries is sponsoring this farm tour series. And this is probably the last one. And it's in 2 weeks, under 2 weeks. Vireo Farm is really unusual. They've got hydroponics. They've got quail, they've got chickens. Those are both bred for eggs or raised for eggs. And they are restoring wild foods, wild native foods around the area. I've never been there, and it's really cool. And it's free also. So it's on September 25th in the morning, 10 to noon. And that link is in the resources list as well. What else do we have? Do we have anything? Oh yeah, I think this is our last Zoom meeting of 2022, right?
Yep, because
Yeah.
October will be our last class for the year, and hopefully we'll resume again in January. I do have one more thing on October 7th, October 7th at the library. We're going to have a composting class from 1 to 3. John Baruch is going to be there. He's a master composter. He's been composting since the Dead Sea was sick, and he's very good. He knows a lot of stuff. And I think you'll want to come to this, and I'm going to put the date in there.
Okay.
And there it is. And there's no registration. You can drop or by or call the library, and we'll have a few more details on it.
Okay. So this list, if I don't get to it, it says November is composting, but we're just going to do it as another thing in October. So we'll have 2 things in October.
He
That's
wasn't
great.
available in November.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. So that's the 7th, right?
Mhm.
Okay. And let's see what else. Oh, if you are not on the list for Veg Club, I honestly don't know what we're doing next year for Veg Club, if we're continuing or not, but there are probably going to be opportunities. And I would love it if you would get on the Veg Club list. So what you can do is get to me, you can email me. If you're on the Veg Club list, you're already receiving information from me. So that's what that means. You might also be receiving just farm trips information from me, and then you just happen to come to this class, but those are 2 different lists. So you should be receiving specific ones that say, hi, Veg Clubbers. And if not, you're going to get updates about this, you're going to go to send me a message at carol@hawkup.com. Let's see if there's anything left here. I don't have the proper view, so I don't know. Yeah, and I think we are done. How does it come out at 2 hours every time?
We're just lucky.
It's my training from the classroom.
And I just put the link to the resource page in the chat. It should be right at the bottom of the chat now.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Anna.
I'll put it in
Wow.
one more time.
It
just to make
disappeared, huh?
sure. Yeah, sorry. I actually sent it to someone individually instead of the whole group. So now it's
Oh,
going to
okay.
everybody.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, I see. Okay, so we're gonna stay here for a little while so people can make sure that that link is in their grasp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take a minute to
Well,
copy the link, everybody, and you'll have the resources.
yeah, it's been fun for me. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate John's support so much, the support of the library in general. And this started because of Bainbridge Prepares, so I'm really glad. And I'm really grateful for everybody who came. We had some great input and great questions, and it was just very nice. And I really appreciate it. I appreciate that you helped to shape the class by giving feedback on the early forums to say what you wanted to do. Thank you very much. And
Thank you,
thank you.
Carol.
Thanks for the gratitude. Okay, so